So they're actually part of Harvard Forest, which did the dioramas here. And they do a ton of research. So a lot of the statistics I cited about forest cover and about agriculture and our history comes from wildlands and woodlands. And sort of their whole mission is creating that happy medium that I talked about of farmland and also forest, and making sure that we have a healthy habitat that sort of honors our past and sort of channels some of that agricultural energy that we had, but also remembers how important the forest is, and how important it is that we maintain these diverse habitats, and make sure that our open spaces are productive. So I'll leave it right here. I'll stop the presentation here because there is reason to be hopeful. In recent years, farmers markets, CSAs, like the plant sale at Gore Place, there are a lot of local farmers doing a lot of great work, and they're doing it in limited space, with difficult circumstances. It's the saying, if you want to make a small fortune farming, you got to start out with a large fortune, and that's always been true. But with the right resources and with the right support, it is possible to have this reach that happy medium of having healthy forests and productive open spaces.
Fantastic. Thank you, Donnie. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
There we go. All right, folks. So if you have any questions, I think you should be able to put them in the Q&A. If not, I think there's a function there called raise your hand, and hopefully that'll work and we can turn on your mic so that you can ask a question. But if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. If not, we just thank you for attending this evening. And we want to say there are more webinars to come. Donnie has given 2 webinars on farming and the landscape, and this was a terrific sort of 10,000-foot view of the history of farming and land use, really, I guess is what you would call it, how people use it here at Gore Place. Here in Massachusetts. And, Donnie, you put me in mind of, you talked about the Victory Gardens. When I was a kid, the properties on either side of me, where I still am in the house where I grew up, and the properties on either side of me had full sun, and those were all gardened. They were quite, every inch of it was gardened for vegetables, and now they are lawns. And part of it is, I think, there's not the need because food is relatively inexpensive and available, but also the amount of time the people that lived there, they had full-time jobs, and then they spent every evening working in the garden. They didn't watch television. They didn't go to the movies. They didn't have the internet. They weren't distracted by other things. And that, I think, is part of it too, is the will. I know during the pandemic, a lot of people came to the plant sale and they were starting gardening for the first time. I don't know, once things opened up, how many of them continued to garden, because it's tough. It's tough to raise vegetables and lose your tomatoes to insects or rabbits, or, it's not an easy way of producing food when the markets are so available. It seems to be such an abundance. Oh, we do have a question. I'm very glad. Will the recording be available on the Gore Place website? I will. Thank you very much for that question. Yes, we will make the recording available as soon as I can process it and get it up, probably tomorrow. And I will ask our web site manager to put a link up there. So that's a great question. Yes, we will have a link. And I can also, if you want to email me at events, EVENTS, at goreplace.org, I will help you find a link to that as well. So that's a good question. And do we have any other questions? Let's see. Yes, we have another question. Fascinating to learn about, I'm going to read this out. Janet says, fascinating to learn about Middlesex County's ranking in agricultural production. Was this more about entrepreneurship or soil conditions? Fantastic, super informative presentation. Thank you very much, Janet. What do you think, Don? Was it more about entrepreneurship or soil conditions that made Middlesex County so fruitful?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great question. And of course, it does have a lot to do with the environment. So Middlesex County is a really big county. It goes all the way up to Lowell, all the way down to I think like Sherburne, like that area. So yes, soil is a big part of it. So just having the favorable conditions, but I do think entrepreneurship and sort of just the desperation, the need to get by. I think people, like I mentioned, this is a really competitive environment. It's really hard to make it as a farmer, and just making the most of your space. That was the key. I think farmers in Middlesex County knew they had these big markets right next to them in Boston, and they knew that if they made the most of their space, if they focused on something really valuable like milk or like vegetables or poultry. They knew if they could specialize in that and do it better than the next guy, then they could do really well. So I think it does come down to entrepreneurship, and also that opportunism, just being opportunistic and taking advantage of their proximity to Boston, and also their advantage over these Midwestern farms that could not get fresh produce to them. They couldn't get fresh milk to them. So it's being opportunistic, I think.
Fantastic. And I'll also, I mentioned those two gardens that were on either side of me. I will also say, as far as being entrepreneurial and creative, in those days, when tomatoes came in, you couldn't give tomatoes away because everybody had tomatoes at the same time. Everybody had, corn at the same time. So it was tough. I mean, these people weren't doing it to make money, although they tried to sell I used to go around with a basket door to door for them and see if we could sell a few vegetables to people. But they were doing it basically, they were also canning a lot of the stuff they grew. So they were, using it throughout the year. Okay, so we have two more great questions. So another attendee wants to know, how has dealing with invasive plants affected modern farming in Massachusetts, specifically at Gore Place? What do you think?
Sure. So that is another great question. So invasive species in general, not just plants, have had a huge impact on farming everywhere, but certainly in Massachusetts. And I think the first thing I want to mention is the chestnut blight. So chestnuts were everywhere. I mean, you see in the names of streets, even Chestnut Hill, right next door. Chestnuts were everywhere, and people love to eat chestnuts. They're a nice, big, a meaty nut. And I think it was around the early 20th century when this invasive fungus, which we call the chestnut blight, wiped them out. So there are basically no chestnuts left in Massachusetts. And sadly, that is not the only example. There's an aphid problem with hemlocks. There are a whole bunch of invasive pests and invasive plants, like the Japanese knotweed comes to mind, which you'll see everywhere now. And these crowd out native species, or in the case of insects, they will prey on trees and plants that have never encountered an insect or a fungus like that before. And yeah, I mean, really, all we can that is sadly that's just part of ecological history. In this globalized world, things are, we see with the pandemic, things starts in one place, before you know it, it's all around the world. And I think the only thing you can do really is to diversify. It's, at Gore Place, we grow a ton of different crops. We grow, different rows next to each other. I think it's sort of it's called integrated pest management. That's with, with insects or with pests. But the same goes for invasive plants. And it's, trying to not necessarily destroy the invasive plant, but sort of bolstering the native ones, bolstering the good ones. So here that means, gardening, we're weeding every day, hoeing. It definitely, it makes it more difficult, but it's always been part of the ecology here. You're always dealing with invasive things. And yeah, I think the way you deal with it is just diversify. You don't rely on one crop, because an insect comes and could wipe it out. So you want to just be mindful of what you're growing, where you're growing it, and try not to put all your eggs in one basket, as they say.
And in some cases, companion planting, like you pointed out, the Native Americans did.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. Yeah, we had a problem this year with I think we had rabbits and some groundhogs who were eating a lot of our squash. But yeah, so things like that, you put the electric fence up, and then hopefully, we were hoping that the prickly leaves on the squash would keep out predators, which is what they do, and they did keep them out for the Native Americans. But I guess we must have had a really determined groundhog, because he got through and ate a lot of our butternut squash, unfortunately.
They've evolved along with the butternut squash. All right, so
Yeah.
Susan would like to know, if the state wanted to encourage small farmers, perhaps there should be a tax rebate for using your land for production. Comments? What do you
Yeah,
think?
I agree. So the state is doing more, I think. There is a new committee. There's a new joint committee on agriculture. So there is some interest at the state house for that. But they could definitely be doing a lot more. And I think Massachusetts sort of, if you're in charge in Massachusetts and you think about the state of the economy, you're focused more on what's going on in Cambridge, like the technology, robotics, and you're thinking like information and internet sort of things. But like this whole presentation, as I've been trying to say, it's we are an agricultural state, and we have the potential to grow a lot of our own food, and especially as we see the effects of climate change, we're gonna it's healthier, but also safer, and less risky, I think, to try and grow a little bit of food everywhere, rather than just focusing it in the San Fernando Valley in California, or in the Great Lakes region. It's best to try and grow a little bit everywhere. And the state could definitely do more to encourage that. I think right now they do have some tax exemptions for farmers, that they pay less. And I know they do have another important land policy, where if you're a farmer and you own land, you can basically put in your deed, I want to keep this as farmland. And when you sell it, even after you die, the state honors that. So the next inhabitants have to continue farming that land. And so, what's it called? Wilson Farm in Lexington. That land, the reason they still farm there, even though they have a much bigger farm in New Hampshire where they grow most of their stuff, the reason they still have that farm there is because that land, part of that deed says it has to be used for agriculture. So right there in Lexington, that could go for millions of dollars, that plot of land. And I'm sure they would love to sell it to some developer to build houses there, but instead the deed, their grandfather, whoever Wilson was, whoever founded it, said, I want this land to remain in as farmland. And so that plot of land in perpetuity will remain as farmland. So I think that's a good way to help protect farmers.